Welcome to The Lost Debate, a show for political eclectics. I'm Ravi Gupta, and today I talked to Bradley Tusk, who has been on the show a few times as the CEO and co-founder of Tusk Ventures, which is the world's first venture capital fund that invests solely in early-stage startups in highly regulated industries. And he's also the founder of Tusk Strategies, a co-founder and chairman of Ivory Gaming Acquisition Corporation. He just wrote a book all about mobile voting. And voting on your phone, which is a central topic that we talk about, but just also the barriers to voting. We talk about national politics, Biden or Harris versus Trump. We talk about New York City politics. With that, Bradley, welcome to the show. Well, Bradley, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
So, all right, let's start. Let me posit two theories to you about what's going on with this Springfield, Ohio situation in the presidential election.
Okay.
One is that this is just sloppy and it's going to cost Vance and Trump. You know, they're openly lying, and that's only going to reinforce character concerns that the electorate has. The second, and there was, I think it was an Ipsos poll yesterday or the day before, shows that actually Americans are way more right-wing on immigration issues than we give them credit for. Most of them favor deportations. Most of them are pretty hawkish on immigration. And just the very fact that we're talking about immigration this close to the election and not, say, abortion or other issues that Harris cares about actually is a net win for Trump. Which of those two theories or is there a third theory?
I'm going to go I'm going to go slightly with the former, simply because sort of my macro theory of the election is if Harris wins, it's not because of anything other than the fact that she is not Joe Biden and she is not Donald Trump, right? This is someone who's, has had a successful career, but is a career politician, did terribly in her own race for president in 2020, was actually one of the most unpopular vice presidents in American history, would have struggled to win the nomination in an open primary if Biden had, never run for the second term, and yet got thrust into this situation that's about as good as it gets. But ultimately, the best thing she has going for her is that she's neither of those guys. And I think that the more that America is reminded what those guys are, less Biden now, but Trump, that's the best argument for her, because when she goes out there and makes the case for herself in interviews, it's not really that great. She's not, of course, I wildly prefer her to Trump. I've endorsed her. I've donated 6 figures. I'm doing everything I can to help her. But with that said, I can't imagine I would have supported her in an open primary. And so I think people just need to know she's sane and Trump is not. And therefore, the choice is not someone who has dementia versus someone who's insane, but someone who's sort of okay, but at least not demented or crazy versus someone who is. And therefore, I actually think it works to her advantage.
And, like you, I was skeptical of her as this whole process started. I've been super shocked at the quality of the campaign that she's put together. And, I thought her debate performance last week was fairly good. I think it was, I think on the economy, I think that was the one area they would have wanted to do extremely well in, and I don't think they did. And I think the data bears that out.
Can I challenge your premise there for a second, though?
Yeah, go for it.
Which is, I'm really happy with her debate performance. I don't think it could have gone much better. The convention speech, I think, mattered less, but nonetheless, I think she still did really well. I don't know, and some of my friends are running the campaign, but I don't know if they're running a great campaign or if they're just saying the best campaign we could run is to keep almost a Rose Garden strategy, keep our heads down, not remind the public too much what she's like, because the more they know her, the more they don't like her, and just kind of let Trump hang himself, which is a good strategy. I don't know if in some ways it's a non-campaign to do that, not a campaign.
Yeah, but in some ways it's like you take what you have and you do the best you can with it, right?
For sure. No, yeah. I think they're approaching it the right way.
It's like a Bill Belichick, post Brady football team, right? It's like you don't try to take too many chances, right? They snuck a couple wins off of
those teams didn't win.
I know they took some wins off of my Bills, though. I remember that sort of winter game, if you remember what I'm talking about, with all the wind and all that.
That was amazing.
That's kind of what I think about what we're doing right now here is and I think what you've got on Trump's side of things is he's like evil Josh Allen, and this is, I'm a Bills fan, is like evil Josh.
Wait, you're a Bill. So you grew up in Staten Island. I know you went to Binghamton. When did you become a Bills fan?
Well, my parents moved me. My dad was kind of a mess. He moved us before he left. He moved us up to the Buffalo area. So when I started watching football, I was up in Buffalo.
You were up there.
And then my mom said to me, you'd appreciate this line. She said to me, the Bills are the only team that plays in New York.
True.
And
She's
so
right.
then I became a Bills fan. Right. And when I say evil Josh Allen for our Trump supporters in the audience, I don't mean evil in the sense, everybody knows how I feel about Trump, but evil Josh Allen is the saying for when Josh Allen gets all rowdy and undisciplined. That's what I see from Trump right now. And so the correct strategy there is try to shorten the game. In this case, Harris is trying to create fewer and fewer opportunities for screw ups and just try to get to the finish line. And that's a very pluff strategy,
Yeah, for sure. No, I think, first of all, I think it's great that David is there. He's one of the best sort of campaign strategists in the country. And I think they understand what they're working with, right? And we're talking about there's only two groups of voters that matter here, right? There's a couple of 100,000 people at most across 6 to 7 states who are actually truly undecided, if that. And then there's just how do you get the base to turn out for you? On the base, I think they're doing well, right? They need to rally African Americans, need to rally women, and I think that they're leaning into that really hard. And I think that's why, honestly, I didn't love her answers entirely on abortion in the debate, but I understood kind of why she was hedging a little bit. I think most people would like to hear that, of course, third trimester abortions, with very rare exceptions, is not something that should be common practice, but I get where she was coming from on it. So then it gets back to those, couple of 100,000 people. And the best argument to make, like I said, is we're not him. So therefore, bringing out evil Josh Allen makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think like the fact that her net favorability has now gone positive, given where she's come from. She's in many ways, we're going to get to Eric Adams, but she's almost the opposite of Adams. Adams was net 20 positive at the beginning of his mayoralty, and now is net negative 30. She has somehow in 2 months turned her favorabilities around. Now, part of that's partisan politics. Like Democrats are going to rally to their person.
In an election, right. And watch, I do have a general thesis that 40 is the new 50 for executives. Right. And even legislators, I think there's some downward pressure too. And people are just overall so inherently unhappy that it gets reflected in everyone's approval ratings. And they don't necessarily correlate as much anymore to re-election. And, I hope she does win. If she does, and you told me that in mid 2025, she's sitting at 38, I would not be surprised.
Yeah. And well, on the sort of Vance Trump side of things, I'm sure you've seen this Wall Street Journal article that they posted. I think it was yesterday. It was super thorough explainer about what's going on down in Springfield. And we'll link to it in the show notes, which I thought this was the most helpful.
Yeah, I didn't get through all of it, but I saw it.
Let me read you this detail, which I'm sure you've seen ricocheting through the internet. A Vance spokesperson provided the Wall Street Journal with a police report in which a resident had claimed her pet might have been taken by Haitian neighbors. But when a reporter went to Anna Kilgore's house Tuesday evening, she said her cat, which went missing in late August, had actually returned a few days later, found safe in her own basement. Now, if you read the police report, it's crazy. This woman found meat, quote unquote, in her backyard, put it in the fridge thinking it was her cat's. She finally found her cat, was so horrified that she went and got her daughter to help her translate to her neighbors, her Haitian neighbors, to apologize, which is, I think, a heartwarming part of the story, that this woman was duped, apologized. When the Wall Street Journal reporter came to her, she was kind of distressed, still wearing a Trump shirt, but saying basically was kind of embarrassed and appalled by what she did. So I think the heartwarming part of this is that humans are still humans, no matter how bad our national politics are, is that once she realized she was caught up in this insane story, she apologized. But the fine print here is really bad for Vance. When you read the story, he knew, he had called the city manager. He knew that this woman, that there was no evidence on the ground for any of the stuff he's saying. He still said it. He's still saying it. They're still calling them illegal immigrants, even though most of these folks are under temporary protective status.
But that's why Trump picked him, right? At the end of the day, Mike Pence, even though you and I disagree with probably 90% of what he agrees with, there was still some there where he didn't certify the election, in the way that Trump wanted. And Trump wanted a VP for whom there was literally no there, and who would say and do anything completely independent of facts or ethics or morality. And that's exactly what J.D. Vance is.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of me just believes, the part of the story I'm hanging my hat on is the woman herself who went and apologized, because I'm like, all right, at least on the ground level, and it comports with what I know, which is, I just did this immigration series on Staten Island, and it was rough, and there was people threatening a priest, and the priest didn't comport himself well either. And it was just a breakdown of civility. But then I still remember, these people I know, when you push them, are going to be kind to their neighbors and are going to be nice people, irrespective of the national politics. And so on the one hand, this woman did the right thing, apologized, which is something Trump would never do. It's something Vance refuses to do. On the other hand, they view their own supporters as pawns. Like, they embarrass this woman, you know, they seem to have no conscience whatsoever that they're putting their own supporters in the middle of this fight. I don't know. I mean, I shouldn't be surprised, I guess, but it's just a depressing episode.
Yeah. And look, honestly, I was on someone's podcast the other day that was kind of Israel focused, and they asked me kind of how American Jews should think about the race, right? And I said, look, you can, one, like every voter, think about your pocketbook and decide, you know, who you think you would be better under. That is a reasonable thing that every voter could and should do. Two, you might have an overwhelming policy issue like Israel or abortion or immigration or whatever it is that means so much to you that it will heavily dictate your vote. But three, we have to live in the world of whoever wins this election, right? And for me, like, I don't know for sure that Harris is better for me on every single thing than Trump is. I mean, the truth is, as someone who makes a lot of money from a tax perspective, I'm probably better off with Trump. However, the chaos that comes with living in a Trump world, just the constant conflict, the constant lying, the constant just absolute mess. It's too fucking stressful, man. Like, I don't want to live like that. And like, I'm willing to trade, you know, some policies that I might not like as much under Harris. A lot, obviously, I like a lot more under Harris. And I'm willing to trade maybe, you know, some economic policies that aren't as good for me personally for the peace of mind of not living like that. And I think that in a lot of ways, that's kind of what we should take away from all of this, which is, you know, if Trump does win, we're going back to chaos. So my son, when he was like 7 or 8, he and I started reading the New York Post together every morning before school. And when he hit like 11, Trump won. Biden won. And we're about 6 weeks. It's probably like February 2021. We're about 6 weeks into the Biden presidency. And Lyle says to me, is Biden still the president? And I was sort of taken aback by the question because he's only another 6 weeks early. But what do you mean? Yeah, of course he is. And he goes, well, you never really hear about it.
It's amazing.
And what I realized Lyle meant was he had come into age only in the era of Trump, right? So the only thing he knew and could compare it to him, Trump was normalcy, and Biden actually being what we expect the president to be like was the abnormality. And like, that's fucking crazy, right? And I had to explain it to him, no, this is actually what we want. What you're used to was sort of the crazy part. You just don't know because it's the only experience you've had. So like, I just ask everyone, and I know if you listen to this podcast, you're for Harris, but
you'd be surprised.
To just think about,
when we do the sort of data on the audience, they're actually right leaning.
All right. Well, then if you are truly undecided, I just ask that you think about, do you enjoy living in a world of that much chaos? And if it doesn't bother you at all, that's one thing. But if you do find it stressful, and I think most people do, I think that should factor into how you choose to vote.
Now, there are all kinds of polls ricocheting through the internet as well here. And there were a lot of favorable polls for Harris this week. But by and large, they're all fairly slim margins here. There was a lot of good Pennsylvania polling for her, for example. There is this sort of requisite war on the pollsters going on. As of this morning, everybody's turning their fire on Nate Silver. I actually just defended him on Twitter, just saying, look, like, he's transparent about his assumptions. He might be the one model that still has Trump favored, but he is explaining his assumptions, is transparent. You could disagree with it or not.
Right. And by the way, that is sort of very emblematic of sort of the illiberalism of liberalism these days, right? Which is, yes, in theory, we believe in freedom of speech, but should anyone dare deviate from the talking points that we decide are the ones that are proper and allowed, we're then all going to go after them. And I think that's shameful.
Well, the funny thing is, it's a lot of the same people who are getting angry when we're pointing out Biden's decline. It's these people who just don't want any bad news whatsoever. And the irony here is, whoever, Pluff or whatever, the Harris campaign is leaking their own unfavorable polls because they like being the underdog. They don't want a Hillary Clinton phenomenon where everybody's just saying they're ahead and they're going to win, and that depresses turnout and and creates a sense of complacency. They want to be viewed as the underdogs. And what's crazy is like some of their most ardent supporters, though, will attack anybody who says that they're underdogs. My personal belief is it's about as close to a 50-50 race as we get. Nobody has complete information here, especially when you have shifting turnout. Like if you look at the past few presidential elections, yes, like turnout is relatively stable compared to a lot of other countries, but there have been major differences from election to election in key groups. And when we're talking about a difference of 80,000 votes here, 50,000 votes there in one state or the other, like just slight changes in our African-American voters enthusiastic, our non-college whites enthusiastic, like is Trump shaving off 5% with the black
for sure. I was doing, and we'll get to the mobile voting book later, but like I was doing an interview with some reporter yesterday about my mobile voting book, and they said to me, well, isn't this just now sort of an automatic benefit for the Democrats because younger people will vote more on their phones than they do now, and they're automatically for the Democrats? And I said, no. I said, when it was Trump versus Biden, Trump was actually ahead among younger voters. And then, Harris has managed to sort of turn that around because there are real differences. But, taking I think one of the mistakes that the media makes and Democratic kind of insiders tend to make is they assume things are fixed that are not fixed. Like forever you hear Texas is turning purple, Texas is going to be blue. And I say, why? And they say, because we're becoming, majority minority. We have so many Latinos. And I said, yeah. And well, they have brown skin, therefore they're Democrat. I'm like, no, they're not.
Yeah, now they're pretty much a Republican. I mean, it's close, but they're net. Right. I think more Republican than Democratic last time.
You certainly can't make that assumption for sure. People just keep making those assumptions across the board. And there's a lot of fluidity. And I think ultimately this race, and we're talking about the tightest race possible, is going to be at the margins, those demographic shifts where African Americans or Latinos or young people, whoever it is, move 10 points in one direction or another, or their turnout sort of overperforms or underperforms by 10 points, and that's going to determine the winner.
Yeah, during the 2022 election, I went down to Swing County in Pennsylvania, and I was talking to Latino voters there, and what I found there was, which is an obvious point that I've talked about on this podcast a lot, which is there was frustration that Democrats talk about them as an identity group, not as a complicated mixture of preferences like anybody else. And a lot of them were like, hey, we're small business and medium-sized business owners now. A lot of folks are, a lot of the Mexican immigrants of the 90s now own their businesses.
There's so when I ran Mike Bloomberg's campaign in 2009 for mayor, I was really careful to segment Latinos because in my view, Puerto Rican, this is for New York City specifically, but I think the point pertains larger. Puerto Rican and Dominican New Yorkers who have been here for a couple of generations were a very different type of voter than Central and South American immigrants who had come here more recently. The Central and South American immigrants were more like Asian voters in a lot of ways, or just in the same way that Caribbean voters and African American voters are different. I think that in a way there's more commonality among recent immigrants, whether you're from Central or South America or West Africa or the Caribbean or China, than there is among people who have been part of the U.S. for multiple generations and sort of inculcated into the social safety net and our politics and everything else. And yeah, I mean, there are just so many distinctions here. So can I ask you a totally separate aside question? Because you mentioned you went down to 22 to kind of do your media type work. But lately, I got a lot of very well-meaning people saying to me, oh, I'm going to go canvass in Pennsylvania.
Tons of friends.
And my reaction, and maybe I'm totally wrong, and maybe I'm like a total asshole to say this to them, but it's like, I'm not sure that rich white people from Manhattan going to other places to tell people how they should vote is helpful to the candidate.
Yeah, I think it depends on which phase of the race you're in, right? Because and you know this, but for the audience's sake, you've got the voter ID phase, right, which is the vast majority of the phase where you're just trying to figure out what people's preferences are. You've got, which is a lot different now than it was back when I was running campaigns. You've got the persuasion part of the campaign, which is sort of where we're in the transition now from persuasion to GOTV, right? Persuasion is where you really need it to be neighbor to neighbor, right? That's where I think you can't have that New Yorker coming in. When it comes to turnout, it's a little trickier because sometimes you're just reminding people to vote. You're just trying to find them. In that case, a warm body is fine, but it's better if they're local.
How many people, okay, so because we're only talking about 30 counties across 6 or 7 states, right? the amount of money, once they do the math between the super PACs and the campaigns that will be spent on each of those voters, is going to be astronomical, the most ever per voter in history by a factor. Is there any shot they're not aware that it's election day? That they really then need, like, my neighbor from Soho to knock on their door to tell them?
It was crazy. I was listening to Tim Miller's podcast yesterday, and I would say, of course they would know, but he was playing clips just of people, and this is very unscientific. It's like people TikToking, going up to like, registered voters who are swing voters, and like some of the clips are funny. It's like people didn't even know they're eligible to vote. Like they were talking to like this Indian guy who's like, I didn't even know I registered. I don't know if I didn't even know I could vote in this country. And so it's like,
right.
I don't know. I share your skepticism.
Although now it's probably too late. If you haven't registered, it's probably too late.
Yeah, but he was registered. Point. That's what the weirdest thing about the clip was.
Oh, yeah, look, that's, when we get to it, that's why I think mobile voting is so important. But, if someone is not aware they're even registered, the odds of them then choosing to show up on election day and wait in a really long line and everything else are relatively low. Now, look, if it's free volunteers, their ROI is sort of endless because it doesn't cost you anything. But it's I just think the efficacy here is
here's where I would think it could matter is in a place like Pennsylvania has pretty extended early vote, which is get all your people to vote early as like right now. Get as many of them out there because then you de-risk election day. If there's bad weather, if there's life events or anything like that, that would be a good investment of time and resources. And obviously so much.
What also de-risk election day? Mobile voting.
Yeah, so let's talk about mobile voting. So you got to transition here. So you wrote this book called Vote with Your.
It's almost as if I host a podcast.
I know you've got this book called Vote with Your Phone. First of all, you've got like an incredible amount of people involved in this project. You got a forward by David Hogg. Hogg, is that how you say his name?
I think it's Hogue.
From the Parkland situation. You have Martin Luther King III writing a section of the book. But let's start with the problem, because you and I have talked about this a bit on this podcast before, but refreshing people's memories. The problem you're trying to solve is how hard it is and how annoying it is to vote, pretty much, right?
Yeah, I mean, the real problem I'm trying to solve is that because of gerrymandering, the only election that typically matters in this country is primaries. Primary turnout is typically 10 to 15%, sometimes even worse. Here in New York City, city council primary last year was 7.2%.
That's insane.
And because the people who vote in primaries are either A, the far left, B, the far right, or C, it's special interests who know how to move money and votes in low turnout elections, that not only dictates who our elected officials are, but it dictates what they do once they're in office. So we have made working together, bipartisanship, compromise, consensus, actual progress and results literally impossible, because if you accept the fact that politicians are human beings who want to keep their jobs and will do whatever they need to do to keep their jobs, then they're just going to play to the base and play it safe to get reelected. And so for as long as primary turnout is 10%, 12%, we are never going to be in a situation to fix any of our problems in a meaningful way. But simply because if we believe that politicians are self-interested and they'll move wherever they need to move to stay in office, if we can get primary turnout up to 25%, 35%, 40%, it moves things towards the middle simply because higher numbers reflect the will of the mainstream. And, I think there had been an argument that you're just never going to get people to care enough to bother. But as you know, I ran a lot of the campaigns around the U.S. to legalize Uber, about a decade ago. And at the time, we were a tiny little tech startup, and the taxi industry was a big, muscular industry with lobbyists and politicians and donations and all the other stuff. And the way we beat them is that we figured out that through the app, we can mobilize our customers, and ultimately millions of people through the app told their elected officials, hey, I want this thing, don't take it away. And we won in every single market in America as a result. And the question I started asking myself was, like, these same people, they don't know who their city councilman is. They don't know who their state senator is. They're certainly not voting in their primaries. But they just advocated for us. What if they could vote this way? And so what I'm trying to sort of both figure out and do, I didn't just write a book about it. I've been building the technology, funding the campaign, everything else, is I have the belief that if you do make voting exponentially easier, a lot more people will participate. And if a lot more people participate, it changes the underlying incentives for politicians. It pushes them towards bipartisanship and getting things done. And that's how we finally solve our problems.
Now, okay, I'm with you on this, but to throw out the arguments, the obvious arguments against this, number one is that it's less secure. Let's start there.
So let's tackle that. So the first thing we did in the mobile voting project was we funded pilot elections in 7 different states where either deployed military or people with disabilities voted in real elections on their phone using the existing technology that was out there in the market. And to be clear, they were all audited by National Cybersecurity Center, all came back clean, turnout increased exponentially. But, a lot of cybersecurity experts said, hey, this is not secure. We can't trust this. We can't do this. And so we looked at the recommendations in the U.S. Vote Foundation report and said, okay, if we can meet these recommendations, if we can build technology that is end-to-end encrypted, end-to-end verifiable, air-gapped, has multi-factor authentication, biometric screening, and most importantly is open sourced, could this work? And that's what we've been building for the last 4 years. We're going to finish it sometime next year. And once it's submitted for review by, various external experts, I'm going to put it free and make it open source and available to any government who wants it, free of charge. Is all done on my foundation. And here's how it works. So we'll use New York City since you and I both live here. You would go to the App Store and you would get the New York City Board of Elections app. You would download it. The first thing you would sort of just put in is your residential address so they could verify, yeah, Ravi is a voter in New York City. You're in the right place. Then they've got to determine is Ravi, right? So the first thing is multi-factor authentication. So the same way that when you're using Google or Amazon or anything else, you're getting that text to your phone and you're entering that to show like, okay, you're you. Then there's whatever security a local jurisdiction uses. When we did the deployed military, there was first a facial recognition scan and then biometric identification using your fingerprints. So the system is built to do that. If a place has less security, that's okay. We can handle whatever system they have. Once it's confirmed, okay, Ravi is definitely Ravi, the online ballot pops up. And the idea is to make it as simple as possible, right? You want it to be easy for people. But what it does, because it's online, is it eliminates the risks of hanging chads or stray pencil marks or undervoting or overvoting, all the sort of typical mistakes that the human beings make with paper ballots. Once you've double and triple checked it, you are sure this is what you want, you hit submit, and 2 things happen. 1, the ballot is immediately encrypted. 2, you get a tracking number so you can follow the progress of your ballot throughout the process. The ballot is then sent back to the Board of Elections. They air gap it, which means they take it offline. So now it's no longer accessible to the internet and it can't be reached by a third party somewhere else. And they decrypt it only once it's offline. And as soon as they decrypt it, a paper copy of the ballot prints out. You can ensure that your ballot was both received and printed through the tracking code. And then because the code itself is open sourced, anyone can check it and say, hey, we found a bug here. We found an abnormality. And then if something went wrong. And so I think especially when you compare that to the systems we have today, and I'm not arguing that mobile voting should replace any form of voting. I'm just saying let's give people an additional option. I think it's exponentially more secure than what we have right now. And it's exponentially easier. And when you hear people tell you we can't do this, it's not secure, these are the people who benefit from the status quo. They like things the way they are. And they can't say, I don't want more people to vote. But they know that if they claim security and they pay some various experts to say that for them, they can hide behind that. And that's what they're going to do.
Now, is there, I'm so technologically illiterate, like in open sourcing it so that people could find bugs, does that also run the risk that people can, take advantage of their knowledge of the code to?
No, because it doesn't get you under the hood. It just shows you the design for the car. So no, it wouldn't allow you to then actually tamper with an election itself. But if we built it in a way that is wrong, or because look, we're not an election company, right? We're just building the tech and giving it away. So as each jurisdiction adapts it for their own use, because people have different signature requirements and things like that, if anything, the adaptation was wrong, you'd be able to tell that by checking the open source.
The second sort of argument that people give against this is that, hey, actually making it too easy could lead to people voting who don't know anything. It could be like the opposite problem.
I'm sorry, have those people
ever, Australia, right? Where is it that it's compulsory voting? And
yeah, but you know what? Australia seems a lot less fucked up than we do. They have their problems, but we have a dumpster fire of a government, right? We were just talking 10 minutes ago about a presidential candidate, one of the 2 major candidates, knowingly lying about people eating cats and dogs. That's fucking crazy. And yet, even though they know it, they're still doing it, and it very well may actually work for them, right? So I don't think, I mean, when you think about the cost of mobile voting in terms of any risk it may pose, you got to compare it, A, to the existing forms of voting and their vulnerabilities, but B, much more important, to maintaining the status quo. I don't believe that we will be one country in 25 years if we don't fix the problems we have, because when you are in a constant state where the only thing everyone can do is scream and point fingers and call names, ultimately you can't get anything done. And so, look, if we had a government that functioned extremely well with low turnout, leave it be. If we had a current sort of in-person voting system where people voted in very high rates, great, that's democracy, leave it be. But when you have a dysfunctional government and incredibly low voter turnout, you can't leave it that way.
Now, the third is, I guess this is less a reason not to do it, but an obstacle to doing it, which is politicians rarely pass legislation to change the conditions that get them in office. This was why it was so hard in New York. You know, people who listen to this may not know this. New York had some of the worst voting laws for a long time, in part because the politicians here, Democrats though they may have been, were benefiting from all the restrictions. And it's very much structurally similar to this, right? It was like the restrictions were making it hard to register, hard to change your registration, hard to vote. You know, you and I have talked about how insane it is that not only do we have all these different people to vote for, but there are multiple election days in New York, which just makes it really hard to keep track.
They deliberately make it very, very
How do you solve for this?
You solve for this in the same way that every major reform in American history has happened, which is you got to build a movement and you got to overcome the status quo. So like the status quo did not want to give women the right to vote. They did not want to pass the Civil Rights Act. They did not want to pass the Voting Rights Act. They did not want same-sex marriage. They did not want the Americans with Disabilities Act. They did not want labor unions. But in every single case, the people stood up and said, bullshit, you are saying this and doing this solely for your own protection and not for the good of us and the public. And we demand differently and we demand better. And it's going to take millions and millions and millions of people standing up and doing that. The book that I wrote in many ways is an open letter to Gen Z saying, if things seem fucked, it's because they are, but here is the way to fix them. And in order to do that, you can't be passive. You have to stand up and be counted. You have to join in our efforts. So we're going to need to be able to mobilize a lot of people because ironically, we're going to unite a lot of Republicans and Democrats and unions and lobbyists and trade groups against this, because if you know how to hold power in the current system, you're not going to want to make it easier to lose power.
Now, if you were to guess like where this would catch fire, like, you know, after, you know, you were talking about getting the technology right and rolling it out.
Yeah.
Like, where are you most optimistic?
Well, the first thing is I want to start at the municipal level, right? Because let's start small and see how it goes. School board elections, city council elections, things like that. There are some cities that we're targeting for legislation next year. Atlanta looks interesting to me. Miami, Nashville, Minneapolis, Anchorage, Colorado Springs, a few others. But we'll see. We haven't made any decisions yet on that. And my hope would be that we can pass legislation in some of those cities, get people starting to use it, see how it works, see what does work, see what doesn't work, make adjustments, and then we can expand it to state legislative races and gubernatorial races, and maybe even it's just in primaries at first. It doesn't even really need to be in the general election, and kind of work our way up. And it may be 10 years before every election in America can be voted on by your phone. And by the way, the election that where mobile voting would matter the least is the presidential, in the sense that it actually is the one election that has really good
like
turnout.
60+%. Which is right. In this country.
Which in this country is amazing. So like why I would love to just see it available for everyone, for everything. Where I'm really worried about is city council primaries, state senate primaries, state rep primaries, mayoral primaries. You know, it's 70s. I've worked in city government, state government, and federal government. I've worked in the executive branch, worked in the legislative branch. And what I've learned is 70 to 80% of what affects our lives on a day-to-day basis happens in local government, not in Washington, D.C. And while Washington, D.C. is certainly important, if you said to me, mobile voting can get primary turnout in local elections from 7, 10, 12% up to 30, 40%. And all of a sudden it takes things away from the extremes. Look, that's the same in my view, whether it's the state of Texas on the far right or the city of San Francisco on the far left. And it just moves those towards the middle and lets them function better. I would take that in a heartbeat.
Yeah, and you mentioned something that's really important to underline earlier, which is, let's take the 7%, I think you said it was, in New York City council races. Mm-hmm. Now, let's pretend you are the union that manufactures the, who mixes the concrete for our sidewalks, right?
Yep.
Nobody knows anything about who you are or anything like that, except for the city council members themselves, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. So if there's 7% turnout, you're like, okay, we're gonna activate all of our concrete mixers, and we're gonna also pay off all the right people to turn. Like, we're gonna, lock arms with the people who, are operating, who manufacture the sanitation trucks and do this, and this, and we're all gonna, basically turn our people out. We're all gonna scratch each other's backs, and if I can get double the amount of money for mixing the concrete, then what would be reasonable, nobody's really going to notice because it's a small percentage of the budget, but the city council members are going to notice because we're a discrete small group of people who have something to benefit, and there's a diffuse cost to an electorate that's not showing up. And I think that's what happens in New York,
exactly,
in almost every area, which is why everything's so damn expensive.
It happens everywhere, right? That's why we can't build affordable housing. Is you have the unions on the construction side do that. The environmental groups have power in low turnout primaries, so they're able to block stuff. Community groups have a lot of power in low turnout primaries, so they're able to block stuff. And all these things that seem very progressive, environmental review, union labor requirements, community review, but guess what it leads to? No new affordable housing, right? And people can't afford to live here. And so, yeah, that's the problem with the system. And that's why, we've got to broaden it out. But I do believe, just like you're sort of much more regular person who said, oh, I like this Uber thing and I really would like it to not go away, I'll press these 3 buttons. Will everyone vote in a city council primary if we could do it on their phones? No. But some people, while they're waiting for their coffee or they're sitting on the subway or whatever it is, will choose to press a couple of buttons. And that, by definition, the good news about turnout being so low is it doesn't take a lot to materially increase it. And the good news about our politicians mainly caring about staying in office is they'll adapt to whatever they need to adapt to stay in office, right? And so, yeah, right now, the concrete mixers have disproportionate power in the system. And one of the reasons why your taxes are so high and you get so little for it is because they're able to charge so much more money for concrete than they should. But if their vote share went from, 10% to 2%, then all of a sudden their power is diffused. Or let me give you some kind of more tangible examples. Guns, right? So the book tells the story of a guy named Chris Jacobs. Chris was a congressman from Western New York, right outside of Buffalo, your Bills fans, and super Trumper, MAGA, didn't certify the election, all the stuff, right? There's a supermarket shooting in Buffalo about 2 years ago. 10 people die. You might remember that. And it's about a mile from Jacob's office, and he's very shaken by it, as a decent human being would be. And he said in a press conference, we got to do something, right? And that was really, he wasn't even that explicit. He was like, we can't let this keep going. Just for saying that, the Republican Party line and the Conservative Party line were both stripped from him. He was immediately removed from the ballot, couldn't run for re-election just 2 months later, and his career was over. And, it kind of makes sense, because if turnout in Chris's primary is 12%, and half that 12% are NRA members, they don't want someone who would even consider the possibility of different gun laws. But if turnout in the same primary were 36% instead of 12%, 2 things would happen. 1, the NRA's vote share goes from 50% down to 16%. And 2, if you just look at polling of Republicans, they may not want an assault weapons ban, but they would certainly favor more rules around making sure that the least mentally ill people can't easily get assault rifles. And you would get better laws and policies simply because the politicians want to stay in office. Or closer to home, Amazon, if you remember, wanted to put their second headquarters in Queens and Long Island City. And if you looked at the polling, the vast majority of the city supported the deal. The vast majority of the district supported the deal. But AOC came out against it. It wasn't her district, but it was her neighboring district. And the local state senator, a guy named Mike Gennaro, said, oh, shit. if I support this deal, even though most of my constituents want it, someone's going to run against me in the next primary because of AOC. Primary turnout is not going to be more than 10%. And that 10% are the furthest left voters that we have. And I really run the risk of losing my next primary. And so he had a choice, 40,000 new jobs for New Yorkers or one job, his own. And he picked himself. I had 40,000 new jobs. The pandemic hit the next year, and we desperately could have used those jobs. But if turnout in Generis' primary were 30% instead of 10, just based on the polling of his district, not him being a better person or anything else, he would have been for the deal. And so fundamentally, the only way to take away the power of the extremes, take away the power of the special interests, is to get a lot more people voting. And the only way to do that is to take the same devices already in our pockets that we're using for our banking and our healthcare and our love lives and everything else, and let us securely vote that way.
Well, let's shift gears and talk about another New York story here, which I can't let you go without asking you about, which is Eric Adams. Our audience will be familiar with the basic contours of this story, but I'm curious as to where you think we go from here.
Yeah, so there's a lot of permutations, and I think what you have to do as the host here is stop me when I start getting too granular and confusing. Okay, so
I think it's fine. Let's go into as much detail as possible.
Okay, right. So possibility number one, Eric Adams gets indicted. This to me would mean that he has to be part of this kickback scheme. So when you look at the 4 separate investigations into Adams, one of them is this Turkey thing, which really doesn't make any sense at all. So the two that to me really seem to have legs, unless there's just stuff we don't know about at all, which is possible. But based on what we know publicly, there's the NYPD scandal where it seems like they were taking bribes to let nightclubs and bars and others either stay open illegally or they were shaking them down. And then there was the broader scandal of Tim Pearson and Phil Banks, who are both top advisors to Adams at City Hall, who were, awarding city contracts and taking kickbacks for that. If Adams was putting money in his pocket as part of those deals, he's going to jail. It's all over. However, if he wasn't, and I'm not sure that he was, to be honest, then the question becomes, what did he know? When did he know it? All of that. And that starts to get very vague and gray. If you might remember, Bill de Blasio was heavily investigated by both the U.S. attorney and the district attorney when he was mayor. And they had a remarkable press conference to say, we believe he's guilty. We believe he's corrupt, but we also don't think, given the current standards of proving Honest Services Act public corruption, that we could necessarily win in court, so we're not going to charge him. So I think for Adams, he gets indicted if there's money going in his pocket. If there's not, I think that indictment becomes a lot harder to bring. And as we discussed before we started recording, you went to law school with Damian Williams. And you tell me, is his personality such that he would roll the dice and say, this is a tough case to win in court, but I'm going to bring it anyway? Or would he only bring charges against city mayor of New York City if he knows he's got it?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think, I know personally both of the sort of key sort of prosecutors in Manhattan, Damian, and then I helped Bragg get elected. Obviously, they're very different characters, and also very different structures of their office, which I think gets to some of the questions around elections that we talked about, right? I think they're both very ethical people, but with very different worldviews. Bragg is by design, he's a politician. He's got to get elected in that office. I think his instincts on the Trump case was to do what a U.S. attorney would do, in part because Bragg comes out of that world, which is, I think Bragg's initial assessment on the Trump case in Manhattan was that that Trump was probably guilty, but that he didn't have the horses to push it through, and that the precedent was too unique to bring a case that had political implications. And I think that was the initial right judgment. And unfortunately, he was pressured into bringing that case. Now, Damian doesn't have
as an elected official, right? I know Alvin, and I do think he's a highly ethical guy. But again, he's also an elected official.
Yeah, I think he got bullied, honestly. And I love Alvin, but I just think he got bullied in that case, and I think it was the wrong case to bring. Damian is different in a lot of different respects. Number one, he is. I'm trying to think of who I would even compare him to. He is the ultimate. He would view this as an insult, but he is the ultimate bureaucrat, like in the sense of like he is very good at being careful what he says, using the machinery of government to achieve what he needs. And if you notice, he's not Preet, he's not Giuliani. He doesn't say a lot. Like he just gets up and he utters the words that he needs to utter to get his cases done. But if you look behind the scenes, he's fairly aggressive. Like
Yep.
he has overseen, what are we now, a SBF? Diddy got arrested this week. The FDNY investigation went down. They seized Eric Adams's phone, right? There's just so many different actions that you'd view as aggressive coming from Damian Williams. But at the same time, he's winning, he's shown that he wins his cases. And I think that's the difference, I think, in some parts between the U.S. attorney's offices and the DA's offices, is that the U.S. attorney's offices are way more conservative. They don't like to bring cases they don't win. I think the way that federal courts operate and that the way that these things are staffed are tilted heavily in favor of prosecution, right? You have much more high quality lawyers, much more resources. The rules of procedure and sentencing are all really, really bad at the federal level. So all is to say that I would be very concerned if I were Adams, because you're going to see people flipping left and right.
Oh, for sure. If I, as you know, but remind the jurors, I testified. I was the deputy governor of Illinois for 4 years, and I had to testify.
Blagojevich, right? Yeah, explain Blagojevich to our audience really quickly, because they'll probably forget.
So Rod Blagojevich was the governor of Illinois, and he was an old school politician, and ultimately was arrested on 24, indicted on 24 different counts. The ones that got the most attention were that Obama won the presidency in 2008. The governor of Illinois then gets to replace the new senator, and Blagojevich effectively was holding an auction to decide who would get the seat. Now, it wasn't an auction for sort of personal gain, from what we can tell. It was more kind of campaign money and stuff like that. But nonetheless, lots and lots of examples of pay to play. I got wrapped up in it in that one day, Rahm Emanuel calls me, and Rahm at the time was a congressman from Chicago. And Rod had apparently told Rahm, like, yeah, I'll give you $2 million for an athletic facility in your district. Fine. That's very run-of-the-mill stuff. And Rahm, the money, I guess, hadn't been given. And Rahm's calling me, screaming, cursing, typical Rahm. He's 4 times, call us back, the usual Rahm conversation. And I kind of pieced together that he's mad that the money hasn't been granted. Okay, I knew nothing about it. I'll look into it. I'm on the phone that night with Blagojevich, and I say, oh, hey, by the way, Rahm called me. It sounds like this thing just got caught up somewhere. You want me I can just push it through and take care of it? And he goes, no. And I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, Ari owes me a fundraiser. Now, Ari is Ari Emanuel, Rahm's brother. He's the CEO of Endeavor, William Morris, one of the most powerful, maybe the most powerful person in Hollywood. And Rod believed that Ari was going to host a fundraiser for him, and he felt like the fundraiser was more likely to happen if Rob was still waiting for this $2 million grant. And I said, hey, you can't link these two things, one's political, one's governmental. And then I got off the phone and I called our general counsel, who's our chief ethics officer, and I reported it and said, you got to put a stop to it. And even though the grant was given and the fundraiser was never held, Rod was indicted for attempted extortion of Congressman Emanuel, and I had to testify to that in both the grand jury, the trial, and then there was a hung jury, so the second trial. And it was a pretty miserable experience. But what I did find is everybody flips, like you said. So, wherever you are, if think about Sam Bankman-Fried, right? He thought these people were his soulmates for life. He's having orgies with them, and they all flipped on him. So, if Adams did anything that is illegal, the U.S. attorney will find out, and they will charge him, and they will put him in jail. The question really becomes if it was more like he had knowledge of things but wasn't directly participating. So, the first thing is, if Adams gets indicted, 3 things then I think potentially occur from that. One is, I do not think he resigns the mayoralty. I think he will insist that he will pull the Trump playbook, insist that he is innocent. So people have been talking about the notion of a special election. A special election can only occur if the mayor dies or steps down. He's not going to step down. So I don't think a special election is likely. 2, I think he will still run for re-election. I don't think, especially because his poll numbers are so horrible, that it is possible for him to win. There have been politicians in American history who have been under major ethical scandals and won. Buddy Cianci in Providence was a good example. Even with Blagojevich, Blagojevich's allies had been indicted before the re-election. We still won by double digits. Rod was an amazing politician, just incredibly gifted politician. And the third thing is, what does Andrew Cuomo do, right? So Cuomo is either going to run for mayor next year or governor in 2 years. He's got kind of one comeback left in him, but he can't fuck it up because, if he messes up the comeback, he's done forever.
Yeah, we've seen that with Spitzer and Wiener, right? They both had comebacks.
And this, I don't know if you remember this because you're younger than me, but in 2001, I think it was, Cuomo, or 2000, Cuomo primaried Carl McCall. It would have been 2001 for the 2002 election. Primaried Carl McCall for the governor, and Cuomo was like, it was seen to be as McCall's turn, and Cuomo, and first potential African American governor, and Cuomo was sort of the upstart and challenged him, and it went really, really badly, and it set back Cuomo's career for years. And so I think a lot of Cuomo's base are black voters. He learned that very, very harshly in the McCall primary, and so if black voters stick with Adams, I don't think Cuomo has a path necessarily. If they are willing to leave Adams, then he
or
does.
The one monkey wrench though is ranked choice voting, right? So if he's the second choice of a lot of those people, maybe,
but you still got to be the first choice of enough other people, right? So progressives will be about 25 to 30% of the Democratic primary. African Americans will be about 20-ish%, maybe it's 25 of Democratic primary. So if Latinos, Asians, and progressive, non-progressive whites all put Cuomo first, and then he gets a bunch of African American second place votes, yes, but you have to be the first place choice of those other votes, and I don't know if he would be or not. So that's the question he has to ask himself. The more likely scenario still, and again, by the time this runs, that could be proven totally wrong, is that everyone around Adams gets indicted, but Adams himself does not. He definitely runs for re-election. And then the question is, how weak is he? Cuomo may say he's not weak enough to challenge. And as you and I noted before we started recording today, a Siena poll came out this morning that had Kathy Hochul at a 34% approval rating, which is historic low. And Cuomo would actually rather be governor than mayor. So he may say, you know what, I want to be governor. And if the election is 26, I have another year to rehabilitate my image, and I think she's actually more beatable, and so I'm going to hold off on the mayor.
Question about that, by the way, I was wondering this morning, and you may not know the answer to this, is if I remember correctly, there was a question about whether he would be impeached when he was governor, but they didn't. Could they re-impeach him when he gets reelected? Is that like a thing based on his prior?
I don't know. It's a great question. Never thought about it. Don't know. There's also, by the way, in that same mix of crazy permutations, let me give you two more. One is Hochul has the ability to remove. So let's say Adams gets indicted and won't resign. Hochul has the legal power to remove him. Now, I don't think she would ever do that because she would fear alienating the black community too much. However, what if, and this is now in the realm of crazy, but even though they despise each other, Andrew Cuomo and Kathy Hochul sit down very quietly and cut a deal. And Hochul says, I'm going to get Adams out of the way for you, and you're going to run for mayor and win, which means you're not going to primary me for governor, and you're going to support me for governor, and we're going to help each other out. It's nuts, but it's in the realm of fantasy. But as we keep seeing in life, whether it's the reality Donald Trump or the Israeli military doing things that you normally only ever see in TV shows and movies, fantasy seems to keep outweighing reality. So
your guy never ran for governor, by the way.
Mike?
Yeah, Bloomberg for the audience.
Not as nearly as good of a job. I mean, I worked for Mike at City Hall. I was the deputy governor of Illinois. I've seen both jobs up close. Mayor is a much better job. And I think you are much more in control. It's much more operational. You are much less reliant on a legislative body. The city council is nothing compared to the state legislature. So I think he understood that after being mayor for 12 years, he would hate being governor. Yeah. So anyway, let's assume that Adams does not get indicted. Cuomo then either does or doesn't run. If he does not run, then it's Adams versus there are four candidates in the race who are not Adams, and they're all in the progressive lane. So it's Comptroller Brad Lander, former Comptroller Scott Stringer, State Senator Jessica Ramos, and State Senator Zelnor Myrie. If any of them could make the case effectively that they are both the progressive and the technocrat. So if you think back to the 21 mayoral election, Catherine Garcia was a technocrat. She did really well. Maya Wiley was the progressive. She did well. If you could combine those two bases of votes, that's enough to win. Where's your money on that?
Who do you think has the best chance amongst the people?
Maybe Zelnor of the four of those.
Yeah. Urkel is what they call him out there in the streets.
But here's the big problem. Garcia benefited tremendously from an early Times endorsement. and the Times is no longer going to endorse candidates in local
he would have
races.
been he if you go to the New York Times endorsement factory, Zellner is tailor made for that.
Right, they like would produce him. Right. So as a result, without the Times endorsement, Garcia comes in like seventh. Right. So like without that, I don't know that putting those two groups together is feasible, which may mean that the election comes back down to Lander and Adams. And amazingly, despite everything, Adams still may be the better choice. There's a lot of different ways this thing can go. And then the other question becomes timing, right? This gets back to your, knowledge of Damian Williams, which is one, traditionally, prosecutors don't like to indict someone during an election cycle itself. And I would argue that once January 1 hits, we're in the mayoral election cycle because the primary is in June. Two, if Trump wins, and there's a 50% chance of that, Damian Williams is going to be fired on January 20th, right? Trump is not keeping the Democratic U.S. attorney for the Southern District for 1 second longer than he has to. And so if you're Williams, you're saying, one, I've got the time pressure of a pending election, and two, I have the time pressure of the fact that I may be out of my job in a few months. Does that prompt him to move faster? Does that make him more likely to not indict Adams because he's like, listen, I don't have the goods on him and I can't wait any longer, so I just got to indict the people around him? Or does it make him more likely to roll the dice on Adams? I don't know, right? But there are so many different permutations out there that if you are kind of a New York City political junkie like you and me, like it's just fascinating.
Yeah, and I said this to I talked to Ross Barkin yesterday, and I said to him, "It's like you just have so many."
Who's very smart.
Yeah,
by the way. I think Ross is right up there in terms of people who understand this.
He was a fun guy to talk to, and I think like and he's probably more of the Lander variety. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he's more pro de Blasio than I am for sure.
Yeah. He was when I launched New York City Deserves Better, which was an IE to get rid of de Blasio in 2016. Ross did a big hit piece on me in the Village Voice because he loves de Blasio.
Yeah, and I kind of
I've forgiven him.
I tried to make my spirited sort of anti-defensive de Blasio yesterday without sidetracking the conversation. But one thing that we were talking about is just like this. Like I just don't know. Like New York has so many famous people and impressive people. This is every election. I always say this, and then it never happens. But I'm like, where are, they got all these people.
Totally.
Where are they?
So the only person to me that kind of checks every box that could work is Richie Torres, but Richie doesn't want to do it.
And that would. I love Richie, and I was an early supporter of him. That would be a nasty race because people hate. Like not the majority of people, but there is a vocal pro-Palestinian element that
the progressive community actually would prefer Eric Adams or Andrew Cuomo to Richie potentially. And then the other person who could win would be AOC, but I think the last thing she wants is to have to run something and be accountable for something, right? She's in the perfect position right now. But if you take those two out of the mix, there's no one really in the congressional delegation or the Albany delegation that sort of fits the bill of what you're talking about, obviously. And look, every fucking billionaire that wants to run for mayor comes to see me because, I did it for Mike. And the reality is, and this is always takes a blow to their ego when I tell them this, but they're both A, not as nearly as impressive as Mike Bloomberg, and B, not nearly as rich. When I ran Mike's campaign in 2009, I spent $109 million. And by the way, I could have spent $509 million. It didn't matter. He's worth $100 billion. These guys are worth like $2 billion, $3 billion. While that is an obscene, crazy amount of money, it's not enough to spend whatever it takes running for mayor without feeling it in your bank account. And so the reality is oftentimes it's like, yeah, I know you're a billionaire, but guess what? This strategy, you're not rich enough for it.
I often think about like sometimes the best person for the job is not the person who can win. Like Zach Iskel is a good example, like the head of emergency management, like good, capable executive, wakes up every day, tries to do the right thing. But because he's such a nice guy, I often wonder whether he's gonna.
Yeah, he ran for something.
He did run for mayor. He was in that race. Yeah, I think that's how he and Adams.
Yeah. Look, there's two or three people in sort of the Hochul and Adams world right now who I think would fit that bill. I think Jesse Tisch, who's the sanitation commissioner, could fit it. I think Adrian Harris, who's the New York State Department of Financial Services superintendent, could fit it. I think Dan Garodnick, who's the city planning commissioner,
people like him. Yeah, I've heard good things about him.
But again, being great. By the way, of the 8.5 million residents of New York City, there's probably a couple of 100,000 people here who would be pretty good at the job itself. But
so Jimmy Otto, if you're out there, this is the time for the independent run, buddy. I would love to see that.
Well, it's funny. I
love
have
Jimmy.
thought a little bit about, me too. If Cuomo isn't better off running in the general as the independent, and you clear out the Republican line so there's no one running on it, as opposed to a Democratic primary. I don't think that's true, but I think that it's like not a crazy thing.
Yeah, somebody like that. I've always admired him. I don't know him personally, but like somebody like a Jimmy Otto or somebody. He's too Staten Island probably for the rest of the city.
He's a good guy. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, there's, to my knowledge, a true Staten Island politician. Rudy was one in some ways, but a true Staten Island politician has not emerged to be mayor in our lifetime.
Never. Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting. I was thinking about doing, and maybe we could talk offline about this. I was like, I had written up a treatment to do a docu-series about the last election, and I was looking at it the other day, and I was like, man, maybe I should dust this off, because I actually think with the indictment looming and all the cast of characters, I'm like, this would be an interesting documentary.
It'd be really fun.
We could talk offline about that.
If you agree with what I said on mobile voting, or if you at least think it's a plausible argument and you want to read more about it, I promise you that for a policy book, it is as entertaining as it gets. It's not that long. It's called Vote with Your Phone, Why Mobile Voting is Our Final Shot at Saving Democracy. You can get it on Amazon or anywhere. I should plug my own bookstore. I own a bookstore on the Lower East Side called P&T Knitwear.
Great spot.
We've got copies for sale there. So yeah, please check out the book. I've got a podcast that Ravi's been on a bunch of times called Firewall. It's about the intersection of tech and politics. And so if you want to reach out, just go to bradleytusk.com or LinkedIn, and would love to hear from you.
Bradley, thank you so much.
Ravi, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you everybody for listening. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe. Our voicemail is 321-200-0570. We have new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday.